good afternoon. My name is Julie Rosenkilde. I'm the director of a Danish NGO called Nyt Europa, who is the initiator of these talks beyond growth, together with Rethinking Economics Denmark and Oxfam EBIS. This digital series will explore the interlinkages of capitalism, climate crisis, and inequalities. And through 8 online talks presented by some of the smartest experts in their field, capitalism is being put under a microscope and looked at through different lenses, and coming up with some of the current errors of capitalism and introducing some new perspective on how to address these errors. So why is this important? It is important to challenge our conventional policy making and to move beyond a harmful focus on economic growth alone. So instead, the economy must focus on human well-being within planetary boundaries. Talks beyond growth speakers represent different perspectives on the economy, which can help advancing the discussion further towards framework promoting social and environmental sustainability and justice. So this talk is the first one, which we have called Postgrowth is an Opportunity, Not a Problem. So it's the first of its kind, and it's also kind of an introduction to the other talks. And this talk is with Nick Meynen. So welcome to you, Nick. Nick is a senior political officer at the European Environmental Bureau, where he leads the cluster of economic transition. He brings over a decade of experience in environmental and economic justice and have a deep understanding of the connection between grassroots struggles and the flaws within the economic system. Nick is a well-known speaker on post-growth and is highly respected for his ability to communicate very complex issues in a clear and concise manner. He has also published his 3rd book, Frontline Stories of Global Environmental Justice, which was also voted as one of the top 10 books on climate issues by climate activists worldwide. He has a background in geography, conflict and development, and journalism, and therefore Nick is well equipped to address the critical environmental and social justice of our time. In this talk, Nick will share his insights on moving beyond the current growth-based economic system and preventing innovative solutions for creating a more sustainable and equitable future. He will address the current environmental and social challenges and the relationship to the economic system. And he will also, of course, introduce the whole concept on post-growth and explain how it can help solve some of these problems. He will probably also share some of his experience and the work he does at the EB in Brussels right now as well. But let's see, I guess over to you, Nick.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you for everyone making the time to be here. That's quite a big expectation you just presented, Julie. Let's see how far I can meet it. So we have 1.5 hours, and the goal is to split it a bit in half, with me talking for the first bit, and then more and more into the interaction bit with you. So get ready with asking your questions so that we can go into a bit of a conversation. Now, let me just share my screen, and hopefully we tested this in advance. This works well. Can you give it? I can now see only Julie. So
it's perfect.
Is it working?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, cool. So post-growth is not a problem, but an opportunity indeed. Maybe just 1 minute about me and the presentation, and then I just dive into it straight away. Who am I? Well, Julie already gave a very, very warm introduction, but I would say I'm just a curious citizen doing some research, journalism, writing, speaking, activism on everything that's connecting economy, conflict, nature, and humankind. And that's at the same time very big, but it's also just my take at it. I'm also not going to claim I know everything about all these topics. And here are just some of my earlier publications, my earlier work, first starting as a conflict researcher, doing study in the Congo, then being 2 years in Nepal, looking at the world from Nepal, and then more and more into ecological economics. What to expect from the lecture? Well, I'll maybe just start with 2 stories, which for me express well the state of play of the world, humanity, nature, and so forth, and from which we can learn some interesting lessons to then look more at the context of these 2 stories, and then on the counter movement against the problems that I have first described, which is then counter movement, which I will call post-growth, well-being, donut economy, alternative economic models and movements around these models. And then it will be your turn. So that's the basic idea for the next hour and 20 minutes. So Julie, I'm just looking at you. You can see the slides clicking, everything's working. Okay, cool. Well, first story. This building, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, very holy cathedral over there. It was visited in 2008 by 2 people from an Indian village. And they walked in, they just tapped on the stonework, and they said to the journalist who was with them, it's really nice stonework, actually. It's can you give me the address of the mining authority of London? Because we would like to mine this place. And meanwhile, the camera was rolling as they were doing their little act or stunt in the St. Paul's Cathedral. The very same day, this was a picture in the Financial Times that the bankers of the City of London were surprised to see amidst all the stock list prices and financial information, because it was the same holy St. Paul's Cathedral which was being smashed into pieces. Of course, 2008, Photoshop was already invented, but yet it was still a bit of a surprising advertisement in the Financial Times. So what was happening that day? 2 very strange events. Well, a third event that same day was there was an annual shareholder meeting of a mining company, which is called Vedanta, and they had a stock listing in London and a business headquarters in London. And so once a year, they get their shareholders together to take the big decisions. And one of the decisions that they wanted to take that year was if they would open a massive mine in India. And you can see it coming now. This is, of course, from the area where these 2 Indian people were from. And so these Indian people, they were trying to put a mirror or like take some kind of a story revenge on the people of London. This was the area where the 2 people from India were from. This is the Niamgiri Hills, and these mountains, they have subtropical forest over them. It's really wild nature, and it's also the house or the cathedral of the nature gods for them. This is for them a holy area. Unfortunately for them, there is bauxite under these mountains, and so this company, they wanted to dig it away for bauxite, which they need for smelting aluminium in a nearby factory. It was a $7 billion plan. And the people in India, they had resisted this plan in India first, with everything that they had at their democratic disposal, from sit-ins to referendums to going to the court locally and even to the Supreme Court in India, at every step of the way, doing what they can to stop this project from taking place. Because, of course, the difference between their cathedral and the cathedral in London is that this Niamgiri Hills also provides water, food, medicine, everything, and fuel for their wood fires, everything that they actually need for their survival. So it was a life-threatening project for the whole communities around this hill range. And in India, the resistance really got big, but it wasn't enough yet. Until they managed to come to London, together, of course, on the invitation of action groups in the UK. They went to the cathedral, they had their advertisement in the Financial Times. It became a media story. There were political people who were starting to make phone calls. What's happening here? Why is this a scandal? Some high politician from India was in London. He noticed this. And yeah, some scandal broke out. And in the end, This whole project fell apart. It didn't go through, it was canceled. The stock price of this company tanked, of course. It went 25% of the value before the project was still ongoing. So it really went crashing down. And it was particularly interesting to see that one particular investor who had shares of Vedanta mining company decided to take its hands off from this Vedanta company after the scandal broke out, because they didn't want to be associated with this story anymore. And that big investor was the Church of England. So they didn't like it that revenge was taken on St. Paul's Cathedral, let's put it that way, financing less than holy behavior. Now, that's just one story, a very quick one. I have more details in my book on that and online. But I think it's an important story. It tells us about, multinationals can be very powerful in having a project, opening a front line on the doorstep of people far away, anywhere on the planet where they need some resources. And it's hard for these people to resist and fight back. But then if they do so and they find multinational ways to resist such a project, if they connect with groups in the UK, in India, sometimes they are able to counter such a project. And this story is, of course, maybe ringing a bell with some of you. If not, maybe this image will help you to ring a bell. Of course, this is similar to the story of Avatar, this blockbuster movie of Hollywood, where you have a same story of a community, in this case on a faraway exoplanet, living in peace and harmony with nature, suddenly being faced with a foreign threat, seemingly being the weaker party of the two, but finding a way to unite, to cooperate, and to resist and to win. And this kind of Avatar-like stories is not just one story that I found in India or one Hollywood blockbuster movie. There are actually thousands of such stories. And there is a certain pattern in these stories, which is linked to our economic system. That's why I'm starting with the story. And between the story and the pattern, there is already just this database, which starts to give you an idea of the scale of this. This is a database of the largest database of environmental conflicts in the world, created over 10 years with hundreds of grassroots activists on the one hand, and ecological economists, researchers from University of Barcelona and other universities on the other hand. I've been involved in this project more as a spokesperson and communication person, but this is a massive project, actually 3 European projects for 10 years that created a database with by now more than 3,000 of these Avatar-like stories, where you have an environmental conflict where some community is trying to prevent some environmental harm being done. And in some cases it's successful, in many others it's not. It's around 20% of the cases that people describe it as a success. You can go there on this database, you can filter, for example, show me all the conflicts with bauxite or gold, or show me all with that company or in that country or on that topic, or you can make combinations. It's a nice tool to use. And one of the things it shows also that these kind of front lines, they are ever more frequent. This is the one specific data set, which has been more elaborated in detail by Global Witness, is the number of environmental defenders who are killed for trying to protect their community by paramilitary in Honduras or by security guards from mining companies and so forth. And Berta Cacheras is one of the more famous examples. And the numbers of environmental defenders who are killed each year has gone up from around 1 a week to almost 1 a day in the last decade, as a small tip of the iceberg example again of how these battles are heating up all over the world, often far from our beds and our media stories and far from where we are. But in real life, not in some Hollywood blockbuster movie, in real life, these conflicts are heating up all over the world. So that's just one story that already gives a hint of how these conflicts are related to an ever-growing demand on resources. In this case, it was bauxite for aluminium. that I showed with the India story. But let's move to another story, which is even more symbolic, because it's not just for some aluminium rolls, it's for a whole lot more. So here I jump from my first story to my second story, and then we move more into context and into post-growth policy making as a solution. So my story again starts with the building. It was the St. Paul's Cathedral in the previous. Now it is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And I don't know if anyone has ever gone there or visited, but it's crazy. If you want to see the top from the bottom, you get neck pain by just trying to stare up. It's almost a kilometer high. But what's really surprising to me about this particular tower is that it's full of concrete and steel. And for the concrete, you need a lot of sand to make concrete for this building. So you would think naturally, instinctively, that in Dubai, that must have been easy, right? Because if you look at the top from the tower to the back, you basically almost see the largest sand desert in the world. However, the sand to build the Burj Khalifa had to be imported from Australia, because Dubai doesn't have enough sand anymore. Yes, I let a little pause there, because you might be thinking, like, what's this guy telling us? It doesn't have enough useful sand anymore. Let me correct myself. Useful sand is sand that can be used for construction, for example, for making concrete. So all the sand that they have in their desert out there, it's not useful for them anymore. And there is a very particular nerdy geological reason for that. It is, to explain it simply, in the desert, you have the wind blowing the sands, they are rolling over each other, the grains. Nothing stops the grains from rolling over each other. That means they are very rounded. That means sand deserts are actually like, you need to see them like marbles, tiny marbles. If you take your hand in a box full of marbles and you try to squeeze it, it doesn't work, it doesn't stick together. While river sand, which is used for concrete, it's more edgy. The grains are more edgy. And when you compact them, they stick together. So all this desert sand, you can't use it for concrete, which is the most used application of sand. But sand is also used for so many other things. It's in glass, it's in computers, in solar panels, it's even in sunscreen. And for most of these applications, the desert sand is actually not useful. So what humanity uses is mostly river sand. So then I went to look a bit like, well, how much sand is produced by all the rivers in the world, and how much sand is used by humans for construction purposes and other purposes. Turns out that nature makes the useful sand through all the rivers in the world, only about half of what we now use. So we already use double of what nature makes every year, which means we are using the stock that nature has produced in the past. Over the last millions of years, the rivers have been producing useful sand, of course. However, once the sand ends up in the sea, there is another problem, because it mixes with salty water. And now think again to this big construction tower. There's a lot of steel in that building as well. And if the water is salty and the sand has salt attached to it, the steel will corrode. So the sand that reaches the oceans, it has to be cleaned first, which is also intensive, because then you need fresh water, which is something that in Dubai is also a bit of a problem. They don't have that much fresh water to clean marine sand. That's why they had to import from so far away. Now, the story of sand, I can tell it for 1 hour, because there are so many elements of it, but I'm just going to briefly just two more little bits of it. There is a city-state, Singapore, in Asia, that has expanded its territory by 20% and more in the last half a century, just by importing sand, putting it into the ocean like these bulldozers are doing, and then building skyscrapers on it. It's a tiny city island, so they needed to import a lot of sand to build. However, since 30 years ago, many neighboring countries, they stopped the official sale of sand to Singapore because it was getting out of control. Too many fishermen in Vietnam, they were suffering from all the sand mining going on for export to Singapore, because the water was too turbulent, so that the fish stayed away. In other neighboring countries, sand was taken from the dikes of rivers, sometimes leading to a flood, with people complaining about the government not protecting them. And one by one, these countries, they stopped selling sand to Singapore, at least officially. So that means the price of sand in Singapore went up from, it was $2 a ton at some point, and a few years later, it was $190 a ton. At that point, 1 kilogram of sand on the market in Singapore was more expensive than 1 liter of crude oil. And we all know that there are conflicts around access to oil. Well, in Singapore, sand became a really big issue then. Because what happened is that you have the unofficial sales, the mafia taking over. And the mafia was all around the area, and they dug up, for example, 24 islands of Indonesia to then sell the sand to Singapore, after which the islands disappeared under the sea level, after which Singapore started a diplomatic dispute with Indonesia about the exact situation of the border between the two, because these 24 islands were marking the border of Indonesia. And Singapore, after they were gone, were like, oh, well, we should shift the border, you know. So it's already an international conflict there linked to the extraction of sand. I'm gonna just keep it short because I wanna have more time for other things, but yeah, I have much more on India, the biggest sand mafia there, many publications in Dutch, in English, also in India. Basically, sand is like the new oil. It's a resource that's everywhere in our economy. It seems like we have abundance, but actually regionally, we start getting more and more into scarcity, which means we either have more conflicts or we have to cooperate better and stronger together to avoid these conflicts. That's the choice we have. We can't just sit on the fence. So it's already clear from the story, I think, that the alternative to embracing ever more conflict is to embrace a post-growth, because as long as we have more demand, we have more conflict, or we have to really cooperate really smartly well. So let's zoom out from these two stories and look at the context. This is an installation of the beginning of an exposition in Paris, which is all about one scientific article from Will Steffen on the Great Acceleration. And it was a groundbreaking study. The team behind this study has been invited to Davos 7 times in 7 different years to explain their study. It's had a massive impact on our idea about systems and the Anthropocene and the evolution of humankind. And it shows you the last 250 years with a various set of parameters, how they have evolved. And the parameters are, the first line at the bottom, you will see the population, last 250 years globally. The next graph is the GDP, the economy. It already rises a bit faster than population. But then as you move on, the blue line, for example, is freshwater use. You also have pesticide use. And then at the black line at the very end, which is the most exponential of all, is international travel movements. And what the scientific team has done is, like, they have even much more parameters. By the way, you can't read these graphs, of course, but to give you an idea directly from the study itself, they have seen a pattern that there has been a gradual rise for like 150 to 200 years until the neoliberal era started somewhere, or like after the Second World War, and especially since the neoliberal era, the growth curves have gone more exponential. And that's why they call it the Great Acceleration. And of course, I think since Corona, we know that an exponentially rising curve is really a problem. More people understand that now. That's where we have to flatten the curves, you know. In many of these curves, we have to actually decline the curves. And that's what post-growth is about, because the scientists end their study with saying, of course, these curves, they can't keep growing exponentially. You can't keep doing that. You can't keep claiming that much sand and bauxite and oil and so many other things, because you run into a certain wall with that. And to just zoom in on one that we all discuss so much, climate change and CO2 in the atmosphere, without looking at the actual data in the atmosphere that much, I think. Because when we discuss climate change, it's often about, yeah, the COPs and the agreements and the bookkeeping of states who claim they have reduced this or that. This is the actual measurement of CO2 in the atmosphere in the most reliable place on Earth. The longest history of measurements is the Keeling curve. And I've added in red COP1 to COP27, and I challenge you to find the impact of our efforts so far. So it's a bit of a sobering graph because it shows that the world, humanity, is not on top of it yet. We are not succeeding where the COPs claim to do something about the issue. But it's of course more than CO2 in the atmosphere. This is another graph from the European Environment Agency in Denmark, based. And here you see the global economy, GDP, since 1970, but also the blue line, the global material footprint, which is of course linked to how much we keep digging up. So the economy grows almost in perfect positive correlation with ever more mines that we open up everywhere, which means front lines, which means the stories I've started my presentation with, which means conflicts, which means we can't keep doing this. And you see the green line is the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is, some people claim, decoupled from the growth. However, it's not in anywhere near to sufficiently decoupled from the growth in order to address the actual climate issue. So that's good to know. So that's basically the problem. And then again, from the European Environment Agency, the goal. The red dots on this graph are the EU countries. The other dots are other countries. And the more vertically up you go, the more ecological footprint there is. While the more right you go, the higher living standards. And the goal is to be there in the bottom right corner, of course, with a high living standard with a low ecological footprint. Curiously, the only countries which come near or in it are countries like Cuba, Vietnam, and Costa Rica, and Bhutan, which are not exactly the poster countries or poster boys and girls of the economists who dominate our economic paradigm. Vietnam, Cuba, Bhutan, I don't think you hear them in many economic textbooks as being the example, although according to the data, they perform best in this mix. So the question then becomes, we have the problem and we have the goal, but why are we not succeeding? What's the how? How do we get to the post-growth? Well, one of the main things for me is the mental barriers. And I just took this picture of a medieval city because it's Carcassonne in this case, because you see these nice walls around the city. And if war breaks out, conflict breaks out, then where do you want to be? You want to be inside these walls, right? But we have the same walls around our minds to protect ourselves from all the bad news, all the fake news, all the wars and conflicts going on outside. But in the end, it doesn't really help us to just stay in our walls. If everyone just stays in our walls, in the end, we're going to lose out anyway. So I think it's mostly, we all have our mental limits of what we can cope with. Me too. I can't be open to all the problems of the world. But I think we have to at some point make a choice. And I hope you being here in this lecture or workshop, whatever you want to call it, on post-growth, is already you going in this line, taking a book or going to a lecture and going for the complex answers and not just simple answers, because simple is often wrong and doesn't lead you to the right place where you have to be. So let's quickly go into some of the more complex solutions to the problem that we will have to face with, and then I'll open the floor to you. So we did a report a few years ago, EB together with Oxfam Germany, and they had this nice graph showing the 3 different levels of working on solutions. Because I also face sometimes with people who are only working on niches, and that's fine, but it's not going to be enough. You can't just, I'm also part of niches like great community support agriculture in my area here, but I also don't believe that they will survive the storm of the global climatic changes if everyone just focuses on their own little gardening area, So then you have the regimes, which is more like, which indicators of progress, which governance systems do we have? Mostly what the NGOs and the politicians are mostly focused on the regimes, but then you have the cultural values, our beliefs, our thinking of consumption and markets and these bigger questions. And I'm afraid we also have to change these, because with the current ones, we're probably not well equipped to face the challenges that we now have. So to just give you some idea, there is the We All Alliance, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and they have, for example, worked a bit on the values and the new cultural framework that we need, identifying 5 particular ones, which they think all of us actually could agree with. We all want fairness, we all appreciate and we need nature, participation, dignity, and connection. And we're working with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance on formulating more in detail what that means for the EU, so that we have this cultural framework. I also added in red some line, which I strongly believe in. Every shock or crisis is also an opportunity to change these values and beliefs. Corona, a war, or inflation, it could have a positive effect if we decide to dig deeper and look at what's the cause of this. How can we get better out of this? It doesn't mean it's gonna be like that, but it's always an opportunity. On the economic systems, we see things like the Stability and Growth Pact, which define how countries in the EU should progress their economies, organize their economies, and every year, every member state has to report to the Commission how they are growing their economy based on a set of agreements made 20 or 30 years ago, long before we knew how unsustainable this trajectory is. So we are working on changing the Stability and Growth Pact. We are, one specific example is of a paradigm or a regime that was fixed for a very long time, was the Energy Charter Treaty. For decades, this defined the rights of states versus the rights of foreign investors in the energy sector. And in bottom line is that the rights of the foreign investors and their future profits was higher than the rights of states to change anything in their economy. So any country trying to close a coal mine earlier than anticipated was faced with a fine of billions through this charter. And we fought against that for many years. And here is some good news. Just 3 years ago, this was thought like, well, you're never going to win that fight. And 2 years ago, well, maybe a year ago, it was like, oh, some countries are now willing to get out. And just a few weeks ago, the EU Commission said, well, it's just not gonna, I mean, we're gonna have to get out. The whole modernization, it's not working. This is untenable. So it seems to be crashing down this old fossil protection treaty. But just to give you an idea, sometimes these bigger changes, biggest regime change is possible. And then you have people like Tim Jackson, professor from the UK, publishing a book about a decade ago, Prosperity Without Growth, that has had a massive impact on the debate in the UK, but also all over Europe, on the direction of travel for economies. And then you had Kate Raworth with her book on the donut economics, also 10 years ago, also having a debate like what are the parameters that we should look at so that we live well, but within our ecological limits. And these two are still quite actively promoting new economic models. This is more concrete than the change on the values and on the cultural level. And then, of course, the niches, they need to grow. They are also important. And I can't go in too many nice, beautiful, small stories here, but I can recommend you just have a look at this documentary, the 25th Revolution. I've been co-producing and it together with Kate Raworth, and it shows visually really nice, some beautiful examples of people finding a way to make progress. Business cases, which are basically post-growth business cases, I would say. So why am I working on post-growth? Well, this question maybe. Are the circular economy, green growth, and European Green Deal not already on it? Are they not solving the problems I have described? Well, you already have a gut feeling by now that no, because green growth is not going to get us out of this great acceleration mess that we are in. And the circular economy is nice. It has some benefits, it has some tools and concepts. It's a nice toolbox. But it doesn't solve inequality. It doesn't solve power concentration. You can have very unequal capitalist companies embracing the circular economy. And it doesn't solve 90% of our economy. Because actually, when I started doing this, it was 9% of the world economy was circular, and by now it's only 7%. It's actually declining. And why? Because we keep digging up more. As long as you keep digging up more, it's harder to turn everything into a circle. Basically, our economy is a pipeline that's become too big to bend into a circle. So in order to have a proper circular economy, you first need to stem the flow of resources through your economy and make sure that this is still creating well-being for more people than it does now, because now we are faced with concentration on the top of the creation of wealth. Should you all feel guilty about this dire state of humanity? Hell no. That's I think it's what you shouldn't do. And here's just one reason of many. The amount of responsibility for the state of play we are in is highly unequal. And even if you look at just the people level, the difference in emissions from the richest 1% to the middle 40% is enormous. I mean, it's 1% of anyone in the world who takes a plane once in a while or a lot. 1% of the plane people cause 50% of all the plane emissions, because they go every day on a plane. They take a plane to commute. And that's just not feasible anymore in the future. And that's actually what scientists are saying. There is an article on that, scientists warning on affluence, saying in Nature, saying you can't tackle our environmental problems without tackling extreme affluence. And that's just on the people level. And then there is another story of how, I mean, we are all pushed in this direction through fossil capital, BP and Shell and Chevron and Exxon, who are like, misguiding us. They know what they are doing. They know what from already in the 90s that they were going to meet cross-planetary boundaries. They knew that, and then they decided to mislead everyone with a lot of money behind it. So that's another story, but not for now. So there is myth, there is reality. I'm going to just try to be short because I am conscious of time. I think a lot of us are still here. However, the fact that you are here, I think you're not with your head in the sand, because you're willing to listen to a complex story, which is not about saving the panda bear or the dolphins from some slaughtering. It's a more complex story of saving life on Earth in its many forms and the future of humanity through change in our values, in our economic regimes. And that's why in the EEB, we've then decided to have this group working on specifically on this longer term economic transition beyond just circular economy, beyond taxation, for example. And this is just a snippet from our theory of change, in which we really have this goal. We have a 10-year plan by 2030. We should really focus on capping and reducing the most harmful parts of extraction and production, which is different than telling consumers what to do, which is different than just soft measures like taxing, because we think that's really needed. If you don't feel too sad and discouraged already by my half-an-hour talk, and you feel like you can cope with some more distressing news about the state of the world, well, these are a few things which I recommend. I'll share the PowerPoint afterwards so that you can, at your time, have a look at them. But bottom line, I'm going to round up. Julie, if I still have like 5 minutes, is that okay? I just see your face. Yeah. Tina, the neoliberal, there is no alternative, is dead. Long live tapas. There are plenty of alternatives. Postgrowth, well-being, donut economy, it's possible. It's also necessary. And it actually offers us more security and stability than capitalism. And security and stability, I chose these words on purpose because they are often used by people who are not necessarily in the environmental camp of the story, but they are also seeking security and stability, only giving it a very different meaning. I think we can agree, I hope, that there is an opportunity, a possibility to move from only just peak emissions, the end of the pipe problem. Emissions are the end of the pipe, literally. And we should also work on the beginning of the pipe of the global economy, and that's digging. So we need peak digging as well. And that means at the EU level, a material reduction target. By the way, Austria just adopted a plan that by 2050, they have 80% less material footprint. That's a kind of example of peak digging. We need this kind of examples all over Europe and at the EU level with, for example, the Critical Raw Materials Act. And we need peak trade and peak stuff in better ways than just by force or by nationalism. I think we can also protect the protectors better. I mean, the people who I've described in the beginning from Avatar story, Berta Caceres, because they are the unknown soldiers of our time, doing all the risky and life-threatening hard work for all of us, trying to protect not just their community, but the global community from further harm being done, from further resources coming into this economy, which are in the end going to lead to all kind of emissions and exhaustion and extraction and so forth. So we should see them as really the gatekeepers, the very important people that we should all seek and strive to protect as much as we can, even if they are very far from where we are at our consumption level only. And I think, yeah, our dependency for well-being on this ever larger volumes and amount of digging and trading and selling and then having waste, that's of course a story that we have to change. Another world is possible. Left of this is a book with just 3 authors with some ideas on what does degrowth stand for. I would suggest to not be discouraged by the name itself. It's a name that academics have chosen on purpose to not be captured by corporate, because in the past any other name like sustainability or circular economy has been captured by corporate, and I don't think you will soon have big business embracing degrowth, but maybe that's just fine. And then you have the French author Timothy, who also is quite a rock star in France nowadays, and he also did a report with us, Decoupling Debunked, 4 years ago already, showing that you can't have green growth and a livable, thrivable future for everyone at the same time. So like, you can't have your cake and eat it. So where is the action happening? The counter movement, just the tip of the iceberg. On the ground actions, I mean, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil. There are so many movements. Just recently, we had 35,000 people gathering in Lützerath in Western Germany, including a team from the EEB who went there to literally put sticks in the wheels of certain extraction machines. And that's important because they put that issue in the public space, in the cultural values of our time. It's important that people talk about it and that they see it. It's not just about what happens that day. It's really important that they do that for the bigger national debate that we have, or European debate that we have about extraction. Then you have all these legal actions. This is the lawyer who opened the court case against the Dutch state, Roger Cox, and who won for the duty of care. The duty of care of states includes it's doing enough on climate change so that we are not all screwed, or our next generation is not screwed. So he won that up to the High Court, with the High Court, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, ordering the government in whichever way they want. Politically, they can choose, but they have to reduce their emissions in line with science and the IPCC says. So that's quite big, and he followed up with a court case against Shell for not doing enough, and he also won that one. So he's breaking a path for legal action. And then just 3 slides on what's happening from the NGO world at the EU level. So that's more my work at the EEB, European Environment Bureau. Just to give you some idea, you have at the EU every 7 or 10 years, you have a big plan, and that's bigger than just the Green Deal. That goes from 2 commissions. And so now, since a year ago, we have the 8th in a row environmental action plan, and that's quite interesting and something we should actually, if you want to work on EU level or even on national level on anything interesting like systemic change beyond GDP, regenerative growth, it's all in there, and we've all agreed to it. It's not just in the past, this was like a vision document from the Commission. This time all the institutions, the Parliament and the Council, agreed to it. It's adopted, it's a legal commitment. So whenever there's going to be a discussion on the follow-up of the European Green Deal, well, this is kind of stick behind the door that we have to have something like that, regardless of the elections and the new commission coming in. So it's interesting to look at that. If you want to learn more, Grace O'Sullivan from Ireland is the MEP who leads from the Parliament side on the implementation. And then in the Parliament itself, I mean, we've seen that the debate on post-growth is growing. You've seen this debate first in the academic community. I've brought it to the EEB, but others have brought it to other NGOs. So the NGOs have also stepped up in the last 5 years, I would say. And in the European Parliament, you have now a very big conference coming up in May. I don't know if some of you have heard of it, but I really recommend go to the website, register soon enough, because it's going to be packed with 1,000 people before you know it. And there are 7 plenaries, 20 parallel panels. It's like the Woodstock for everyone who's into post-growth or degrowth. You name a person, Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel, Timmermans, 20 MEPs, they're all going to be there, including, of course, the leading thinkers around post-growth. So there is momentum in the parliament on this topic, like we should do something. And in civil society, there is also really a momentum, I would say. I just posted 4 things we are doing with 4 email addresses of people who are leading on it. So we have a new coalition, specifically NGOs focused on how to do something about peak digging, the raw materials coalition. And this is a new coalition that's just building up. And we just this month actually were able to hire the coordinator of this new coalition at the EB, Robin Rules. Myself, I'm more involved in this coalition with We All, WWF, IEEP, a think tank, Zoe Institute, and so forth, EuroHealth, there is Can Europe. There's a growing group of NGOs involved in the EU Wellbeing Economy Coalition, where we also have a vision text and plans and communication plan and so forth to focus on this, the well-being economy, what it stands for and what that narrative can offer us and so forth. Kati, my colleague, is more in the Fiscal Matters Coalition on everything monetary. She's leading on that coalition, again, with trade unions, with youth. It's very broad. And the other colleague, Margaret, is leading on a project that we have to basically bring partners together to build this momentum, to build this movement, basically. Like the academics, they have a degrowth movement. We should have a degrowth or post-growth movement from the civil society as well. And we're also fundraising for specifically doing more on that. So this is just some tip of the iceberg things that's happening at the EU level, and there are more resources is for answer questions. So I guess I'm gonna wrap it up here. That's a little bit more than half an hour, but still time for some interaction, I hope. If you're still here, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for a great presentation, from the concrete stories to what you actually are doing also at EU level and policies around it. I think we will also open up the floor quickly, so you can also ask questions if you have so please raise your hand already. I know there's some questions in. Whoops, I was just muted. So I'll try again. You said in the presentation that we can always use a good crisis, and you can see that there's something happening at EU level. I will start pointing out at EU level, you work in Brussels, Niederober works in Europe. Maybe others have other questions as well, but with the corona, we saw a change in the Stability and Growth Pact with the war in Ukraine, energy crisis. It has been the change to get out of the Energy Charter Treaty. However, we still have the 8th Environmental Action Plan. And now this spring, there's going to be a huge debate in Parliament, as you just mentioned as well, on post-growth. But of course, things are changing. But can you say maybe what you also do for these campaigns to make the EU change its narratives or change its legislation? We had some crises which made them change it. But how, for example, how do you use the 8th Environmental Action Plan on a concrete level to change policies within the different commissioners? Because it's not only, of course, on environmental or climate or issues related to that, but how do you use such a program in your work and to influence so we can actually see the changes on highest level? Because at the same time, as you also mentioned, that the European Green Deal, green growth is not really changing anything, and that's the big policies coming out from the Commission.
I mean, the Green Road, the European Green Deal is not all bad. I mean, it's the best progress we've had in a long time on the European Commission level. So let's not put it in a waste bin too soon. However, the narrative, the framing around it is still not where it should be. And as a result, the concrete specific targets are not there where they should be. So just to nuance that a bit. Now, how we use the 8th Environment Action Plan. Let me just give 2 levels of examples here. One is more, I would say, narrative meta level. Sometimes we do lobby letters reminding a specific commissioner at a specific occasion when they are in a position to decide on directive on, for example, critical raw materials or another specific directive. And sometimes in our lobby letters, we remind them of the 8th EAP because it has quite some useful language for us on systemic change, on policy coherence. So it's mostly they've agreed to a visionary text, but when it gets to the nitty-gritty, they often make compromises. It goes through a trialogue, and then it's us reminding them of their big vision in a more lobby letter specific hook. But that's one level, and then there is a more specific level. So you have the Joint Research Center, the GRC. They are like the think tank of the Commission. So they are now obliged to make a report, a study, including focus groups, on what is beyond GDP framework of indicators should then look like. So what the well-being economy should look like, how do we measure it? What does it mean? So we've had, I think, 3 calls now with Peter Benksur and his colleagues at the GRC discussing this since June. So like every 2-3 months, we have a call with them. And they are, for example, seeking to do maybe 1 or 2 focus groups with 100 people from Europe to see for a day or 2 days, what does a well-being economy mean for European people? And they want to integrate that kind of result into their study, which they then present to their commissioners, saying like, okay, well, the 8th EAP wants us to do a beyond GDP dashboard of indicators. This is our study. This is what Europeans think. And we are trying to make sure it's as good and as ambitious and as well phrased as possible by doing these calls with them, by maybe organizing such a focus group if we find a project in which we can justify the cost for doing that. So we are seeking like to match our projects and our funding. We have, for example, a project on citizen participation in Europe on the Real Deal project on in general citizen participation in policy making. So this could be a match maybe where we match that project with the GRC's need of having citizens giving input to the well-being economy and what it means. So that's a concrete example of how we try to use the 8th EAP. Well, the question was only about the 8th EAP now, or did you have a double question, Julie?
No, that was fine. It was mainly to see how you actually use it in your strategies as well. You start with your presentation on multinational corporation who uses resources which is not there because of the hunt for economic growth really shortly. But what do you see now? We talked a bit about the EU level. So what is then the role of businesses in this, and how and what kind of can business do to align themselves with the principle of post-growth economy? And do you see any development there also from especially the big companies, or how is this conversation open up to maybe multinational companies as well?
Well, of course, they are not going to be the first adopters usually of a degrowth policy, because that's their purpose probably to grow as a company. However, I have also learned through my interactions with some big businesses that I've learned a bit of a new perspective. I've had a study on Umicore, a big precious metals recycling company, actually the world's largest recycling of precious metals company, which has, it's a Belgian company. They have bases in my hometown. I did a big study on their ecological debt, and they polluted the area, and they actually had to pay all these people who had cancer, actually, you know, and I presented my study to them. They received me, and the big boss was like, I can relate to you, what you're saying. I can understand what you you want, and I personally I feel like we should do something. However, I have my board and I have my shareholders, and if I would just like pay the 320 million that you say we are actually owing to the community, they would fire me and they just seek somebody else who doesn't pay. So what we need to do is to convince the government to actually set up like they did with the asbestos fund, is to force all the big companies who were involved in the asbestos pollution story to pay into a government fund, and then use that government fund to compensate all the people affected by asbestos, so that we have a level playing field, and that actually the companies who are pioneering, who are doing the most effort, they are going to get the most benefit out of this contribution. So I felt like, well, actually, that's a fair point. If you have a high level playing field with strict environmental norms, the pioneering companies who are already doing their best to not pollute too much have a competitive advantage towards the others. Mm-hmm. So you will find sometimes allies in these big businesses. For example, in the Postgrowth conference, I will be leading on panel 14. I will be there together with Kate Raworth from the donut economy, with the boss of DG Grow, and with the CEO of Umicore. So he's convinced that actually it's in his interest to be with me, the guy who presented the 320 million bill to the company 12 years ago, to be fair. It was another CEO, and Kate Raworth in a panel. And the three of us are basically on more or less going to try to convince DG Grow that actually the targets are wrong. They should have other targets in the economy. Mm-hmm. And if DG Grow hears that, not just from some activists like me, or not even just from Kate Raworth, which is already a bit bigger than me, but also from a CEO of a massive company with tens of thousands of employees, and is one of the biggest 10 companies in Belgium, that might make an impression on them. That's our plan, you know. So that's one example of how businesses can. And I also remember chatting with the CEO, or not the CEO, the Chief Sustainability Officer of IKEA. And IKEA, of course, I mean, child labor, tax evasion, we can name a lot of things on them. But on the other hand, they do have some interesting things, like the consumer is not always king with them. They decided to no longer sell the saving bulbs, only LED light, because even if it's more expensive, in the end, it's better for consumers and the environment in the long term. And yeah, so with them also, they were like, actually, we're not just at peak oil, we're at peak stuff and peak curtains and peak tables and stuff like that. We need to look at other business models. And they started like opening, repair your IKEA things. And actually, they have a really bad image of like, it breaks down fast, you know. But I feel like they're also thinking beyond that now. Like, mm-hmm. We can't keep selling more tables every year to the world, you know. We need to think of other ways to, not saying they're there, but I'm saying there are sometimes opening points, which you then have to jump on without necessarily giving the big company your positive branding image, you know, because that's always a risk when you work with the big companies, is that they can say they've worked with the environmentalists and we're okay according to the environmentalists, so everything we do is okay. Well, there are always issues which you still have to give critique to, but sometimes you can work with them, and then find common interest and target that towards the policymakers, because in the end, it doesn't depend on one company doing something better or one enlightened CEO doing something good as a philanthropy kind of measure. That's just little drips in the oceans. In the end, you need the governments, the states, and Europe to really change the whole paradigm and change the level of the playing field. That's what you need, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, there's issues of green and blue washing and everything. So, but it is important to find allies. I'm just gonna take one of the questions from the chat as well. Again, you're more than welcome to raise your hand if you have anything you want to say. But I'm gonna read it aloud. The one from Elise Sundal, who writes, "I find it very interesting that you talk about the need of changing our cultural values and how we think. We need more complex system thinking instead of simple linear thinking." And she asked if you have heard about the inner development goals. Have you heard about it? maybe we can ask Elisa also to explain it a bit more, because then, of course, I don't know if you can speak, Elisa, because you haven't heard about it. Otherwise, you might type it as well. She cannot. Well, then we might have the answer later on when you know about the inner development goals, which might be useful for this transition as well.
Yeah, maybe I don't know them, but maybe I can just say one thing. I mean, from the name only, it makes me think it's about personal growth and the personal and your values in the world. And I haven't really touched on this issue in this lecture or workshop or whatever you want to call it, because it opens a whole other door towards, our place in the world, our relationship with nature is very philosophical, and it could easily take up a whole 1.5 hour session on its own. Just wanted to say that's really important too. Yes, that like if you feel innerly that you have a need or an opportunity to change your position in life, your relationships. I mean, ways of developing it. There are so many ways out there. It can be simple. Like for me, my personal inner development, it comes a lot from being in this community farm. You know, every week I just go to a farm where we take our vegetables out of the ground ourselves, and we are a community, we are a cooperative. We think about the future, and that's really helping me as a person to cope with all of these stories, all of these difficult things. And it's maybe good that it's mentioned, because I also feel there are a lot of people who drop out because of the mental pain of dealing with these difficult, complex issues. So it's a bit of a yin yang story, right? In order to cope with all this information overload and rational problematic issues, you need a bit of self-care. Yes, that's very important. And so if that's what the inner sustainable goals are about, which sounds a bit like that, then yeah, I mean, that's important. But it's just, I don't know them or much about.
She put a link as well if others are interested to look more at it, but of course it's also about the community and not the individual self, which is of course important for this transition as well. Well, Jacob had several questions. I will read one of them out loud at first, and then we will take some others afterwards. But he writes, when you measure resource consumption and compare it to living standards, and you mentioned that Cuba, Vietnam, and one more country. Could you maybe tell a bit more about how you measure this, or how such a collection takes place? So why is these countries mentioned as best practices, or the one who falls within?
Sure. This is from the European Environment Agency. So this is super non-ideological, non-political. This is just global standard data, meaning like life expectancy or literacy rate or income. I mean, these define your living well above a certain level and living below a certain ecological footprint. And these are standardized data all over the world. That's why they can like make a plot of all the countries of where they are. And it's just the fact that people in Cuba live until age of 80. They live longer than in the US on average. They have better healthcare and they have much lower environmental footprint. I mean, that's not an ideology or something, that's just a fact, which is uncomfortable for some who see Cuba, Vietnam, and all these communist countries as, ooh, you can't say anything positive about them, right? Because, and then they start a list, but the data are just data. That's not a like subjective issue. And to give one example, so it's like Bhutan is another example. They have, in the span of 22 years, as they were adopting the gross national happiness as their goal and compass for the economy, and it sounds hippie or I don't know, woolly, but it's very concrete with targets and indicators, and it's different than growing GDP. And in the 22 years, a certain period that has been studied, the life expectancy went up 16 years, poverty decreased in record rates, according to the World Bank, and Bhutan is the first carbon positive country in the world now. They absorb more emissions than they emit. So environment, social, and health, they are just like, wow. And how did they do it? Well, they didn't join the World Trade Organization. They didn't grow their GDP just because they wanted to grow it. They don't follow, the stability and growth pact that we follow. And it seems like they're doing far better. And that's also just facts and data.
There is a reaction from Caroline, which have some likes as well. I just want to ask if Caroline, if you can present it yourself.
Sure. Well, I'll turn
Hi,
my
Caroline.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed your presentation and I loved the use of images and it was great. Yeah. So I just had a comment really, and I don't mind if you have an answer or not, or maybe somebody else has a thought about it. But I'm always struck, that one of the reasons, also because I talk a lot to policymakers as well and people, in various government positions and all the rest. And I often get this very strong fear of talking about post-growth, degrowth, like there's almost a visceral reaction, we mustn't talk about this. And even if you try to put it in a very diplomatic way, it's still like, we don't have a degrowth agenda. It's like, it's kind of, it's almost like a taboo to mention. And I think part of that is the fear of losing investments, because if you look at the way the whole international market is set up for finance with credit ratings and all the rest, once you have there's a perception that your country isn't going to grow, or it's going to have a recession or even a depression or something, then there's there can be a big problem with money being pulled out of the country. And then of course some countries can print their own money or make their own money, but then they might not have access to the energy they need and so on. So it's all very intermeshed and complicated. But basically, I suppose my main point is just that I think it's really important to look at the financial system and how that works, and to think about ways that it can be changed so that it can function even when we haven't got an expanding economy, or even when the economy is contracting. I think there are ways to do it, but it really needs to be thought about and taken seriously. So that was my comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. And yeah, we had a session on exactly this half year ago with people from Haponomy and with you and with some few others. And we talked about things like modern monetary theory and SUMC, another monetary system. And it's important that you flag it out. I don't have the answers, to be honest. I mean, I think you know more answers than I know, but it's good that you flag it because it's important. It's something I'm also struggling with, to be honest. Yeah, but on the other hand, you could, I mean, I have a few starts of answers, at least, it's not complete, but the fact that you have Ursula von der Leyen, Frans Timmermans, 20 MEPs talking together for 3 days in the parliament on beyond growth. They didn't seem to care that rating agencies would downgrade the EU for talking about beyond growth. I mean, it seems like there's just a growing realization that this is a reality check. And in terms of currencies and losing access to the financial markets, that's indeed that's why I think it's important that Europe goes a bit its own and better way and doesn't stay as dependent as it is now on the dollar as a as a global currency of last resort. So there is some work on that front too, which I think you and maybe Kati in the Fiscal Matters Coalition might have already better answers for. So it's not like we're not doing anything about it, but we should do more. And I'm not the best placed person to give the answers to that one, I'm afraid. Just have to also just acknowledge that I don't know the answers to everything.
Thank you to both of you. We have a question from Sophie Marie Nielsen, as we say in Danish. She writes that we are some young climate activists in Denmark who have just started and tried to create some alliance with unions and try to bring some public attention on degrowth politics, like shorter working weeks, public job guarantee. and something that might engage more people from also the working class. So she has a question: which politics do you think we should can bring us closer to degrowth? And maybe also a bit on what your advice is to what can we do in a country like Denmark. Actually, the debate on degrowth and or beyond growth or new economic thinking is not as big in the public debate and between policymakers as it kind of is in Brussels. It's bigger in Brussels. So maybe some advice on how to help some young activists in Denmark. I can also say to you, Marie, that in Nyt Europa we're also doing a lot to like this series to discuss it. And at the People's Meeting, Folkemøde, we also a big group who have this theme. So please also contact us for trying to reach out to more people as well. But what is your advice, Nick, sitting in Brussels, looking at member states and maybe knowing a bit about Denmark as well?
Well, I don't know that much about Denmark, although I was in Copenhagen in December at the Green Party Congress. I was invited by the Minister of Donut Economy in Brussels. She's implementing the donut economy. She was using the Green Party Congress to spread the word to the other Green parties in Europe. And maybe one way to do it is to also look at how we have done it in the EU. I mean, we've had first, you have the academic debate. The way I see it, you have the academic debate, then you have the NGOs embracing it in there and making it really, it's a process. I mean, I started at the EB 9 years ago. I came in and we had a circular economy team and I was like, yeah, that's nice, but it's not enough. It's just 10%. What about the other 90? And people were like, whoa, calm down, guy, you know. But it took me like 4 years until I had enough members of the EB saying, actually, we do need to do more than circular economy. We need things about beyond growth and concentration of power and capital and inequality, which is not addressed by the circular economy. And then so it took me 10 years or 9 years to really have the EB really fully embracing it. And then you have like, okay, so we have academics, NGOs, and then parliament. So in the EU, we've had in 2016 an MEP joining the Degrowth conference in Budapest, which is this yearly gathering or 2 yearly gathering of academics and activists working on degrowth. It was Philippe Lambert. He was on the center stage in the main debate, and I was there, and I still hear him say, okay, guys, I will bring this debate to the parliament. However, I will never, he used it 3 times, never use the word degrowth, okay? That's my compromise. So it became Postgrowth. So and then 2 years later, we had the Postgrowth conference. And that's another answer to what something you said, Julie, like, or Caroline, like maybe for politicians, it's really important to not always push them into embracing the word degrowth. That's the word that the academics use to stay pure in their concept and not be hijacked by corporates. In political world, post-growth is already tricky, but beyond growth is even lower barrier to engage with people because more people agree that we need to move beyond the growth paradigm. So getting into parliament, some debates, actually in the UK, they also did it like that with Caroline Lucas, making parliament debates on beyond growth. And so now in 2018, we had 8 MEPs from 5 parties doing maybe 10 events in 2 days. And now 2023, we are having 21 MEPs, 3 days from 6 different political groups. So once the MEPs embrace it and it grows in the parliament, it becomes harder and harder to ignore for the government. And it becomes also, every time there is a debate on beyond growth in the parliament, for us, that's a massive hook to go all out on the media front. And that's how we also grow. In 2018, when the post-growth conference in the parliament took place and we were co-organizing it, we had a letter with academics and then civil society and then a We Move petition that had in the end 100,000 signatures about it's time to move beyond the Stability and Growth Pact. And then we had a media plan and translations all over Europe. And the result was the day the parliament event started, we were the only front page news in the main newspaper in Belgium. We are growing ourselves to hell, with me being quoted. And then every next day there was a reaction from bankers, from politicians, like what's happening? What did these guys do with the parliament? But there was a debate on it, you know? And we had in the end 40 articles in 20 languages in 1 week time all over Europe, just because the event in the parliament took place. So we're now also lining up a lot of media work to make use of the fact, Ursula von der Leyen on 15 May is debating Beyond Growth in the parliament with the rock stars of the movement. That's news, but we need to make sure that the media all over Europe report about it in the way that we want them to report about it. So my advice is, find those in parliament who are maybe willing to engage with you, get traction, maybe organize something in parliament in half a year or a year from now, and then jump on that opportunity to go all out in the media, and it becomes part of the public debate. Not saying that this is a blueprint or the golden way, but that's just how I can share my experience, how I have seen it grow in the EU sphere.
Right, I think that was good, and of course it's just to try to work on it in an awareness raise as well. And let's do something about the Beyond Growth conference in the Parliament in May. And I think we have put a link where people can sign up and also join at the conference. So let's see if we can at least do something in Denmark, awareness raising around that conference as well. Yeah, sorry, Nick.
Yeah, I forgot, actually in the beginning of your question, you mentioned also working with unions and working time reduction. And that's indeed a very good way, because we also work with European Trade Union Federation, and we did a report with them on just transition and on work and working time reduction. And they also did a whole 2-day conference in December on the just transition Beyond Growth. They are very involved in this debate. So you can work with unions on this, and it's actually quite important. Naomi Klein is also all into that, You can't just work only on environment and carbon taxes without looking at the social issues. You need to, marry the end of the month with the end of the world and go where people's concerns are. And we are all working harder while being more productive, less compensation for it. And then there is a burnout epidemic in Europe. As well, and if you talk with people on that, and from there go to post-growth and degrowth, you might get a lot of new people in your movement, and it's very important that happens. We just published, I should maybe post that in the chat also, a new report on working time reductions from the environmental movement together with unions as a very important step towards post-growth. Yeah, anyway, I'll just find the link and listen to one of the last questions probably.
Yeah, exactly the last question, but it's kind of aligned a bit. There's a question from Vivienne who asked about pension schemes and funds for the future. So how does, well, in Europe we have an structure that means that that we have an aging population, more people who depends on our pensions and the funds in the future. So how does this work in the context of degrowth or post-growth, like the scheme of pensions? Do you have any inputs to that, and how do you work on concrete measures?
Here I should not claim any expertise that I don't have, because I haven't worked on pensions. So I could make up some story, but that's not going to help you. You should, that's just honest, I haven't worked, but it's fair. It's fair to point it out that you need to maybe have a report on how, but I'm sure some other people in the degrowth movement have thought about that. It's just not me. Sorry for that. Yeah.
No worries, Nick. And I'm sure it's something that might be raised during the next 7 sessions in some way, or we can ask them in advance. So this can be answered as well.
Hey, Julie, shall I maybe share screen and show the last 5 slides of my presentation? Because that's like more resources. And I think people might find it interesting to see where they can go next after the lecture if they want to learn more.
I think that is a very good idea. So we just have 3 minutes to go through those slides. I think to where to find more information.
Yeah. Okay. So more resources. The EB, you can see the slides.
Yes, but also the notes and everything. But I think it's fine now.
Yeah, I'll just quickly. You have Turning Point also in French, which is the lessons we can learn from the pandemic. Also 10 ways forward for various things, from food supply trade, mobility, mining, democracy, and so forth. I did also the trailer on that. These are the 10 things, ways forward, that lessons we can learn from the whole pandemic story, I think. This is from 4 years ago, where we definitely showed like you can't just green grow your way out of the mess we are already in. We need to think beyond sustainable growth. So left is the report, right, our policy recommendations. This left again with Oxfam that I mentioned before, where we looked at the well-being economy, the whole narrative, and to the right, together with trade unions, the escaping the growth and jobs treadmill. So that's just a few hints, and yeah, my books. There you go. So yeah, and I mean, I can share the PowerPoint, and you will find more in there. So.
That would be great. Nick, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. I'm sure we will hear way more to your work as well in the following years on this. And thank you for giving us a good introduction to the whole thematic area on post-growth and beyond growth and all the different wordings to the same topic. And thank you to everyone who have also joined today. Again, you can see next presentation again later in the channels of Nyt Europa, but we can also share it through the email of everyone who've signed up to this event. So next week, just for you to know, on the February 22nd at 5 o'clock, we have the next talk, which is with Jason Moore, who will talk about planetary justice against planetary managers, and it's moderated by Lars Koch, the Secretary General of Oxfam IBIS. So that's also going to be very interesting, and of course we have the session the next 7 weeks as well. So once again, Nick, thank you so much for kickstarting the conversation.
Thank you for inviting me, organizing all of this, for all of you to make time for this, and yeah, I wish you all good luck with whatever you're doing on helping the world to become a better place. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Nick.